Hello, welcome to the third episode of the Deep Shiz podcast. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Eric.
All right, so last time we ended people getting taken off a plane and killed, maybe, but also people making impossible calls off of planes. And now part four, that was part three. Now we're doing part four here, which is the Pentagon being attacked, and which is super interesting on many levels. Um, so they go into the attack, and there was like they talk about how there were some guys in suits meddling with the debris. Do you remember that?
Yes. Yep.
Really crazy, and they even have like images like they were there messing with the crime scene basically, and that nobody knew who they were, and they just didn't get in trouble. But I don't think anybody really knew who they were from, except for like maybe they're from the Department of Defense. I don't know, or maybe the FBI
I,
or something.
I wouldn't be surprised if they were FBI uh, there to alter the crime scene to clean up any uh, unhelpful evidence. One of the critiques of the crash in the Pentagon is that and we'll get into this later, I'm sure, the lack of wreckage that looks like an airplane. And of course, you wouldn't want to have any wreckage that looked like a cruise missile there. So these
Right.
guys were there to make sure that happened. And like you say, it's altering a crime scene, definitely a no-no.
Yeah,
And
that's just
in
against
the
the law
case,
in general. And like a murder scene, it could be like a bad crash. If you come in and start messing with stuff, that's got to be illegal. And then there are people who said they saw like a commercial plane. Well, then there are people who said they saw like a commuter jet, so like a smaller plane, not a big Boeing 757 or anything like that.
so I've listened to a couple of eyewitness accounts to the airplane allegedly hitting the Pentagon, and they are all over the place. There are people who say, like a woman from half a mile away, she says, "Oh yes, that was definitely a 757 American Airlines crashing into the building." And what surprised me about that one was that this woman knew what a 757 looked like from that distance. And then there's a taxi driver uh, saying something about the airplane clipping the light poles, and then other people talking about a commuter plane, an Apache helicopter, and I just would not be surprised if some of those eyewitnesses are, plants of some sort to kind of obfuscate what actually happened, kind of create the idea that there was indeed the 757 that crashed into the Pentagon. I think we'll see that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there was no airplane that hit the building.
Well, eyewitness testimony is already so unreliable. So when you put in some red herrings, yeah, I think there are some red herrings in there, or just some people, maybe some paid actors or something. You kind of muddle it up even more. But the fact that people saw anything other than a commuter plane, because I think most people know what a commercial airline looks like. I mean, you see it all the time on TV. People have ridden in one. So the fact that a lot of people saw something other than that is kind of telling that it was like something smaller. And then you brought up something earlier. Also, the weird thing was not a lot of wreckage. I mean, usually after a plane crash, every time after a plane crash, they always see like pieces of something somewhere. Every piece has to go somewhere. I think it doesn't just disintegrate in this kind of crash. They couldn't find the engine cores. They couldn't find most of the plane parts, like the fins and the stabilizers, that kind of thing.
Uh, yes, so like, yeah, the landing gear, the engines, those things are solid pieces of metal in a practical sense. They're just so dense and made of these alloys that are practically indestructible, and are always there when an airplane crashes, even if they're mangled. And of course, in this case, those are not present. Um,
Yeah.
Engines, landing gear, and big sections of wing. And there was a French guy. He did this. He put a composite image together that you see a building with fire and scaffolding damage, etc., but no airplane. And this was probably before those fellows started showing up with the and tampering with the crime scene.
Well, what the really confusing thing is, like, so there's three situations. The official story was a commercial airplane. And then there's the idea of a smaller. either commuter jet or like military aircraft. And then there's the idea of it being a missile. Um, if it were even a smaller airplane, you'd think you would still find more pieces. So maybe they took the pieces away, or I'm thinking it was more of a missile, perhaps. And because like, well, this brings me to another point that there. I mean, you look at the damage; it looks like either a smaller plane or a missile because it doesn't. The damage doesn't look large enough. Um, there's like a, it should have been. Let's see here. They said the damage was consistent with something being 50. There's only 50 feet of damage, but a commercial jet would have caused 160 feet of projected. Like the projected width would have been much wider than 50 feet. So there wasn't enough damage. So I'm thinking like a missile or something like that, or maybe a really small jet.
Well, that would definitely coincide or go along with what we believe happened in Shanksville, where it was a missile hit,
That's
which I think
different.
would
Yeah,
be
that's
considered.
really different. But well, but then I also kind of back away from the missile idea because of something that later on they talk about. There's a hole in the back of that one of the rings, like so something punched through. It just wasn't big enough to be the plane they said it was. Um,
Yeah, that's actually interesting if you look at the damage.
so this is like the hole
But
they're talking about right here, out of the A/E ring.
oh yes, so basically the airplane penetrated the entire structure allegedly, and then made this cutout. To me, it seems like the more likely story is a combination of a missile and then planted explosives. Um,
Maybe, yeah.
if this was planned, they could say, all right, we're going to simulate like the effect of an airplane hitting the building. So we'll hit it with the cruise missile, but to imply that it went through the entire building, we'll blow up some things inside the building along its trajectory. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a combination of those two.
I wonder if it was like a smaller jet or something that was filled with explosives, so it would give the impression of a much larger plane, maybe. So it's like a missile but a plane at the same time. Because there was damage that kind of looked like a small plane, and but missiles do have fins too. Maybe it was like a large missile. I'm not sure. That's
So, so a cruise missile, like a Tomahawk cruise missile, has a wingspan of about like 10 feet.
yeah. It was
Um,
much bigger than 10 feet. It was like 90 feet of damage.
Yes,
So
but if you were to say, "Hey, we're going to do a combination of explosives on the ground and then a cruise missile strike," you could have the same effect of like, "Hey, there's an airplane or something flying, hit the building, giant explosion." Now everyone says, "Oh gosh, it's a 757." Um, if it was a small airplane, it seems like that would add some unnecessary complexity, especially if the Navy has cruise missiles that they can just blast all over if they need to. So my take would be cruise missile, especially since they didn't find like.
but look at this. They did see like these light poles fell over. So that would be consistent with the wings clipping them. Um, I'm kind of in the. I think it's actually a small airplane, but that was like radio controlled, kind of, or like guided, perhaps. I don't know. But either way, they don't want us to know what it is because apparently it was something other than a plane. Because so there was like there's many cameras around the Pentagon, and they
Yes.
didn't want us to see whatever hit it because they only so there was 85 tapes, and they released only one that had like footage from two cameras. So and then there's this whole thing of the cameras. They're mostly in sync except for a couple of frames. And one of the frames seemed of one of the cameras seemed to be altered. But so yeah, they definitely didn't want people to see what hit the Pentagon.
Yes. Yeah. The building is ringed with cameras. People put in FOIA requests to see what's on those cameras,
Right.
and basically they're denied. Uh, the implication there, of course, is that there's something being hidden. And like you say, there's a great in this documentary. There's a great comparison of the two frames that are common. Basically, there's two cameras looking at the same portion of the Pentagon, and you can sync the two of them together, and you can compare the individual frames. And sure enough, several. One of the frames is different between the two and seems to be have been altered, um, hiding whatever was there, whether it be a cruise missile or something else. But if indeed there was a 757 there, what would be the need to alter that frame?
They chose these two cameras because they revealed they like their footage was the most obscured when it comes to plane hitting, and they only released like a few seconds of each one of each camera, so it didn't show a whole lot. And those cameras
Right.
don't are they're not very high FPS. I think it was like 1 frame per second or something, or maybe a few frames per second. But it definitely wasn't. You really couldn't see what was going on. You just saw the explosion, but you didn't see what and whatever projectile went into the building.
Yes.
So it's kind of shady. They felt like, oh, we got to give them something because but they didn't give us very much. They kept all the tapes for some reason.
Well, it's important to note that even cameras on private property nearby were confiscated. So, in gas stations and hotels nearby, um, that FBI agent showed up and confiscated those camera reels. Uh,
That's fascism, man. That's freaking Nazi Germany, man.
I mean, it's definitely overstepping. Like, hey, these guys work for us, right?
Ugh,
Uh,
yeah.
at least I was under that impression
Well,
that they did.
there's eminent
Anyway,
domain. I mean, the government can take private property if they feel justified. There's asset forfeitures. I mean, it's basically like that. They've
mm.
definitely overstepped their bounds quite a bit.
And definitely the behavior is the reason why I have transparency in government is to keep uh, the agencies accountable. And this is, of course, um, being untransparent. Uh,
Well, it seems like the only reason governments should keep secrets is for like military purposes. But this kind of falls into the gray area because like the official story was like a military-esque kind of situation where we were attacked by another country. Um, so that's their lie basically gave them the right to, and people were kind of okay with it because like, oh, we're under attack. This is war, martial law, that kind of stuff.
right?
And
And if someone starts saying, "Hey, you can't do that," it's like, well, that's you're
well,
a national threat for saying that.
well, Michael Moore was saying it, and like people gave him a lot of crap, I think. And I never liked Michael Moore, but he was saying that he was right. That they had all this video footage they didn't release. So yeah, there's that, and then it goes to part 5 at 2 minutes 18 or 2 hours 18 minutes.
Oh,
About
before we start Part 5, let me
oh
just kind of summarize that what we were just talking about at the Pentagon strike. It's like
oh yeah
if you start adding all of the evidence together, we had pilots who couldn't fly the airplane. We don't have evidence for an airplane at the crash site. Um, uh, there was no shoot down order that was given to take down any airplane. The and on top of that, you have the evidence being hidden uh, and not shown to the public. All those things adding together show that there's the official story is being is not standing up to scrutiny. There's all this hiding going on, um, and
absolutely
you can start seeing like, hey, there's other explanations that fit the data much better.
yep, that's definitely a problem here. And in fact, there's like a stand down order. It seems like the evidence is showing that they were actively preventing normal defense measures, that would normally be enacted for the missiles on top of the White House to be used to shoot down incoming, kind of attacks here.
Yes, and then that's a question that doesn't seem to be asked enough. Like, hey, there's ways that we defend against attacks like this. Why weren't they used? And who would have the power to stop those attacks or to call off those defenses? And the answer is people very high up in the military establishment.
Right.
So
I know. Yeah, and then the media is complicit in preventing. They're the ones supposed to ask all the hard questions. They're not asking really any questions. In fact, they were shaming. I was watching this Sean Handy thing, and he was hardcore shaming this guy. I think I told you about it once. That who's just raising some questions, just calling people nuts, calling people crazy. I saw this cartoon where one of the characters, kind of raises a question that maybe the government was involved, and everyone called him stupid and dumb or made fun of him. So they just, shaming people through proxy, basically, by creating these characters in TV shows and make them look crazy or stupid for raising obvious questions, just using common sense.
I think we should insert a picture of a tinfoil hat wearing person uh, to demonstrate.
Yeah, I know. That's the image they use, and it's kind of sad there, but yeah, that's how the media does it. They just use mockery, shame, obfuscation, hiding, boring people. They sometimes just bore people, so they just don't think about what they're talking about. Using really bureaucrats are famous for doing that, just using really boring words and describing things in the driest way possible. So it's just like, okay, go to sleep, everybody. Literally, people putting people to sleep with just how boring they are. So it's like they have all these different tactics. They whole tool belts of tactics.
Yes. Well, it kind of reminds me of like when you go to your terms and conditions.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a wall of text, and you're like, yeah, sure. And it's like, oh, and by the way, we're using all your data and tracking you and so forth.
And it was in
Or we
there.
can do
You
that,
agreed to it. We gave you
right?
the chance to read it. You read the 50 pages that you clicked on. Yes. I mean, yeah, it's insane.
Yeah. Oh, wait, before we go to, there's just this. You mentioned Hannity, just kind of ridiculing that guy with questions, and who is the other guy who is the really angry one? O'Reilly.
O'Reilly, yeah,
There
he
were
was big
there,
on that.
there's a fellow who was like the child of a survivor or of one of the victims, and who was like, "Hey, I really think we need to look at all these concerning things with the evidence." And O'Reilly, he was shutting him down. "Oh, you are a sympathizer. This is disgraceful. You're dishonoring the memory." All these things, and of course, getting very using all sorts of emotional language to shut this guy down, and kind of, I guess, normalize that if someone asks these questions, it's just super distressing and we can't talk about it and it's disrespectful, etc.
They use those excuses all the time. All right, you want to move on to part 5 here?
Yes.
Okay, Flight 93. That's 2 hours, 18 minutes, or almost 19 minutes. And Shanksville was where one of the other planes went down at Shanksville. There's like no pieces left. There was a big hole in the ground, and people were confused. Like, there was a plane crash here, and because people arrived, like the first responders, and they're like, "Where are the plane pieces? Where is the plane?" And the official story is that the plane went down at such a steep angle, it buried itself somehow in like solid dirt, which doesn't make sense physically. Like, the faster you move, the more solid things are, in general. Like, even water acts like a solid if you move fast enough into it. So if anything, all the pieces would be above the ground, not buried underneath. So that was some fiction they created.
Yeah. Once again, it has parallels to the Pentagon flight. um, One of the witnesses describes, there's a couple interesting things that are described by the witnesses, and one is that there was a small airplane flying over the area before the crash.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Which I'm just making that connection. The Pentagon, there was also allegedly a small airplane flying over, uh, and you wonder if there's a connection there. If this was part of the process of guiding in uh, a missile, as an example? I wouldn't think that would be necessary. Um, One of the things that the documentary talks about is how there was wreckage uh, distributed all over the place, little bits, and maybe this
Like
airplane
miles
was
away, miles away. And the official story is that the wind blew it, but they were large pieces. It wasn't just paper. There's a lot of paper, but it was like metal and stuff that was like in like a lake that was like 6 miles away. That's more consistent with the plane being shot down, because it would explode in the air, and then bits and pieces would then be blown away, like, or would from the force of it would be launched miles away. And so, and the fact that they saw a plane there, plane like a plane before the commercial airliner went down, supposedly, people saw a white plane, and um, there's the witnesses said one guy said like the lights flickered, and that indicates a shoot down because what happens is that they zap the radar frequency on everything before they shoot, and so it messes with the electronics of the houses around. Um, and people said they heard an explosion and a missile. And people also said they saw like smoke in like a billowy like shape, whereas when a plane crashes, the all the fuel burns consistently, which doesn't create a billow shape. It creates just a constant amount of smoke going up. So there's always evidence suggesting the plane was shot down by another plane. It wasn't shot. It was shot. Well, it was exploded in air, basically not shot down, but it was blown up in midair.
So I'll maybe add a few things to this. Uh, I guess my take on why it wouldn't have been a shoot down is that even if the airplane was shot down, you would still expect to see the giant plume of burning fuel after it hit the ground. And the crash site is still so small and dinky. It seems more consistent with an explosion, a one-time explosion like you'd see on a missile, like a cruise missile. Um, and cruise missiles do have a ground tracking radar. So with the TV flicker, it could very well have been the radar from the missile as it's tracking the ground and approaching its target, which is
So,
this location in Shanksville.
so you
So
think
I think that
you think it was just the missile hitting the ground? That was it.
that seemed to confirm. It seems to fit all the evidence. So, for example, the crash site doesn't seem to contain an airplane. If the airplane was indeed shot down, you would still have an airplane there. So we have a
Right.
crash site that's pretty pretty Spartan. There's just a couple, like, it doesn't look like an airplane's there. You have a missile, sound of a missile going over. You have a small little airplane going before the crash, which may have been distributing bits of wreckage to kind of complete the story of, hey, there's an airplane here that crashed. So I guess in my opinion, put all those together, and I think it's more consistent with a cruise missile strike. That way, you don't have to deal with this crashed airliner, which still hasn't been located, as far as I can tell.
Well, I mean, so there's a plane being shot down, like still crashes, but what about like a plane just exploding in midair from a missile? So it doesn't hit the ground; it just explodes, and then pieces fall to the ground. I'm thinking that wouldn't create a big crater, though. That's kind of the problem with that scenario. So I think, yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards your explanation where it was a missile that hit the ground, and so there are barely any pieces because it's just the missile, not the whole plane, and they created this story, and that's why people saw the white plane there before the crash, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
All these witnesses were right on the scene really quick. There's just like average Joe Blows who were like, "Oh yeah, we're the first ones. With the volunteer fire department." And if an airplane would have been shot down, uh, you know, the aircraft would have broken into huge sections. We're talking like big old
Yeah,
wings.
I think you'd
The
still see
engines would come down.
the fins, the
Yep.
stabilizers. Yeah, it wouldn't disintegrate the whole thing. That's not how missiles work. And so
Yeah.
yeah, so that makes sense. So it's, yeah, verdict. I think we're both coming to the conclusion: missile hitting the ground, which is weird that they didn't. I guess they had to create some kind of crash to explain what happened to the plane. So what happened to the plane then? What do you think happened to the plane?
So there have been people, and I haven't looked into this too deeply, but have basically said that the aircraft involved in 9/11 were still flying years after the attacks. So that would kind of feed into the idea that the ones hitting the towers were military, and then the other ones that were in Pentagon or Shanksville were not, airplanes to begin with. So people have looked into that, and I guess I just don't know too much about what they've found. Um, my thought on why they did it this way is this, I believe, was the airplane where the guys said, "Let's roll." The terrorists were, you know, uh, I guess the passengers allegedly had heard the the news, and so they what was going on that morning, and so they were heroically going to take over the cockpit. And so, in fact, in this documentary, it does talk about how like that that really couldn't have happened, and maybe that's okay. Sometimes you need a motivating story, so maybe the that whole story was just kind of there to create to animate people to get into the conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Absolutely. Yeah, it seems all very plausible and consistent with what we know. Yeah, it's just kind of a random thing, I guess. Yeah, you gotta just create. I think they just wanted to create this whole narrative, so they just had all these parts, moving parts going. Oh, there's a crash here and a crash there, and with all these moving parts, they just assumed people would be so confused and like, oh, it was all chaotic, and we're not gonna really look into it. But people absolutely did look into it, and they can only hide so much, I guess. Truth eventually comes out.
I hope so.
All right, so that was Flight 93.
I guess I'm just kind of thinking a little bit about that small airplane and what its role was, because it does seem to be at the Pentagon and something similar at this location. I would be curious to see if the debris site was in line. It looks like it was in line with the path of the airplane, Flight 93. But I wonder if it was in the same flight path as that small jet that preceded the crash. That would maybe shed some light on whether or not that small aircraft was the source of the debris potentially.
Well, what would that debris be then if it was like in a lake 2 miles away? Like, what if it was just a missile? It wouldn't create a whole lot of debris, or was it just the pieces of the missile?
It could have been, the missile would have stayed intact the entire time until impact, but I could imagine that small airplane as part of the, creating the story of, hey, there's a commercial airliner around here, perhaps dropping some of that debris, just
Okay.
kind of like planting the evidence, so to speak, right as the missile was coming inbound, so to say like, oh man, yeah, there was a commercial airliner here, just like those mysterious agents appear to be doing in the Pentagon.
Okay, so yeah, a little bit of that action happening. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty shady. All right, so then there's part 6 at 2:39:45, 2 hours 39 minutes and 45 seconds. I like this section a lot, just because it was like so. There's like very little conjecture. I mean, because it was like all facts. Well, I mean, not gray area. No facts in the gray area. It was all just cut and dry. So the two towers, the media tried to portray them as the jewels of New York, but they were not jewels. They had become obsolete. The heating and AC was like outdated and expensive to run. It was the general maintenance was hard to run. It was expensive and would have cost $800 million to modernize the buildings. And that's not counting the asbestos. So they went into the asbestos, and they went to like give you an idea what the removing the asbestos would have been like, and it was like insanely expensive to remove it. It was like almost depressing in a way. If I owned the Twin Towers, I would be like, what are we gonna do? Because like the way they described it before 9/11, the two towers, the Port Authority was in between a rock and a hard place. They had no idea what they were going to do with the towers. Like they show all these workers wearing suits. Yeah, the asbestos. They showed like these videos of people removing it and how much each like session of removing it cost, and it was just so expensive. It would have been like, it's just almost like depressing how much money it would cost to modernize them and also remove all the asbestos and everything. And then Larry Silverstein comes in.
And he's in a hurry to buy this giant boondoggle for whatever reason.
Really excited about buying this money pit, like the biggest money pit ever. It's kind of, they kind of gloss over that. He just bought it. He's really excited to buy it. And they didn't even talk about like, why'd you buy this?
What I find amazing is that he only bought it 2 months beforehand, which, if there's any preparations going on as far as this being a planned operation, those had to go on, many months and maybe years before this occurred. So this may have just been pure opportunism. And maybe like, hey, if we have one of our guys, Silverstein, on the inside owning the property, whoever is planting all the explosives, etc., now can do that with a little more liberty now that the owner is one of the guys on the inside potentially.
See, he definitely seems like someone who's in on it, maybe part of some secret society. I wonder maybe the Bilderberg group or something like that, or he knew what was happening because he just happened to be outside the tower. He was supposed to be in the tower having like a business lunch or something, and everybody who was in the business lunch died. But he just happened to be like at a dentist appointment. He's like, "Oh, bless my wife. She made the dentist appointment for me or doctor's appointment." And he just happened to get insurance on the towers, like the best insurance possible for this situation, which was insurance for complete destruction, which is like, when would that ever happen? Like it's like the most ridiculous insurance or unlikely event, and then this most unlikely event happens. It's just so convenient.
Yes, and he insures it for two separate attacks, so he gets like double the insurance payout, or and they end up settling for I think 4 billion or something like that, which is more than he bought the buildings for.
Yeah. That's why he was excited to buy the buildings. He knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to make all this money. He didn't look devastated that his two towers were destroyed because he just got all that money. So
it's kind of amazing when you think of these people, because in this case, there's a couple interviews in the documentary where he's talking about, I just had a doctor's appointment that day, so and after the doctor's appointment, I got the call about the terrible situation, and you can just see the crocodile tears of him, just like, geez. Oh, it was just so tough. And of course, imagine being a person who that your coworkers and people that are in your building are going to be killed en masse, and kind of going along, with it. It just, I mean, I don't know if you would have much of a choice if you were him. I think if he broke step, he would be in huge trouble and would, there'd be big problems for him. But at the same time, to just kind of play along and, just kind of go through all the acting of like, oh, I'm just so sorry for the things that happened, when it's obvious that he knew something was up.
Well, he also had no plan. I mean, if you're going to buy something that was that much of a money pit, you'd be like, oh, my original plan was to do this, this, and that, because I was concerned about the cost, but he didn't talk about any plan he had, and he just bought them. And then the crocodile tears, and he seemed overly excited about the new towers. And I'm like, shouldn't you be a little bit remorseful that you're building these two new towers on the graves of thousands of people, basically, and or where thousands of people died. But he's just like, he was like foaming at the mouth, like, oh, this is going to be so beautiful. And just, I'm like, that's a little tactless right there. It's almost like you don't care that these people died.
It just has to be so distant from the guy, that he's able to live with himself. I've seen a couple speeches where he's talking and someone will interrupt him and say, you knew what was going on, and accuse him. And then immediately security jumps on the guy and hauls him out. So, that guy's got to live with himself.
I've never seen those. I'll have to look those up. Larry Silverstein, look up those. I guess you'll have to check those videos out. But that sounds like really interesting. Yeah, so like he must have known what was going on. And it's really sad because the first responders breathed in the asbestos when they came to like help, try to help the situation. So when the towers collapsed, it just spread the asbestos everywhere. They just basically created asbestos bombs, and when you breathe that in, it causes all these medical problems for like years and years.
Oh yeah. In fact, there was a lot of people at Ground Zero. There was one picture of this African American lady covered in the dust, and I think she passed away like 2 years ago due to complications. And then there was, I think, at the end of this particular documentary, there's a fellow who's one of the firefighters, and he's he's talking about how he's got some sort of lung cancer,
Oh
so
yeah.
and this is after all of the the experts have assured everyone that it's okay to work through ground zero and it's all within the safe thresholds. And basically, these experts, when they get kind of asked about it later, they're like, "Well, that's just what my people told me." So of course they're not being held responsible. So that pattern definitely, like, there's no one to pin the blame on because everyone's just saying, "Oh, I'm just doing what my people say," or I was just, "Oh, my wife told me not to go to the tower that day." Oh, gee. So a very convenient alibis from everyone.
Yeah, I'm just following order is like the alibi and excuse for most evil in the world, I guess. I'm just doing my thing, or I didn't mean to, or just like I don't remember that, or just like there's always different ways things people say to kind of distance themselves from accountability. It's kind of crazy.
Well, you wonder what you would do, like if you were in that situation and you kind of knew something was going down. Maybe you weren't the one who started it, but you're going to be part of it because of the position you're in. Like, say you're Silverstein, or say you're one of the guys working in security at the office, and you're like, man, why are we letting all these these unmarked vehicles into the parking lot? Well, that's interesting. And you start to put things together, and it's like there comes this point where you have to, you're like, am I going to do something about it? Or if I, step out of line, maybe I end up at huge risk. So it's really kind of a, I
I
just
don't. I
wonder.
don't.
I would hope I would have the courage to
I hope I'm
not go
never.
along.
I hope I'm never in that position. Just don't. Just stay away from power, and you'll never be in that position. Uh,
Fair.
like yeah, I mean, yeah. If this Silverstein guy, if he was strong armed into this, it's because he was in a position of power, or he knew too much, or maybe he was part of some secret society. So it was just he like owed them. It's kind of like the mafia, you owe them something, and if you don't give them what you owe, they'll just kill you, or they've got some dirt on you or something.
We've got
So
a job for you, and don't worry, we'll make it worth your while.
you're gonna make it feel like
You'll
a
get this
billion
great insurance
dollars
payout.
anyway. So he's probably excited about it. Like why wouldn't he want to make all that money? So then at 2 hours 50 minutes and 30 seconds, they described the building because one of the arguments the debunkers said was the building was pretty fragile, but then they described the structure of the building, and it was basically like two buildings in one. It was like there was the outer section and the inner core, and both were extremely durable, and they were the core structure supported 60% of the weight, and the external structure supported 40% of the tower's weight. It was built to withstand redundancy so that it could withstand like strong winds and even a plane hitting it. It was designed to withstand a plane. So the fact that they said it was fragile was just a big lie.
I think the chief engineer was this fellow named Skilling, and he mentions how everything was about 3 to 5 times redundant, which is to say that any of the loads could be increased 3 to 5 times and you wouldn't have any failure. And in some areas, it was 20 times redundant. And so he mentioned, hey, yeah, if an airplane crashes into this, which is the worst case scenario, you'd have some fires and things, but the building would remain.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
and then yeah, so there's the whole thing of the burning jet fuel, which is one of the more famous arguments for and against it. Because people are making the argument, well, jet fuel doesn't only burns at half the temperature you need to melt steel, and then the bunkers were like, well, all you need is not for it to melt the steel, but to soften the steel, and then it creates this cascading effect. All this BS, all this vague stuff that didn't really pan out, doesn't really make sense. Uh,
yeah, the counter argument to that, of course, is that the you can melt steel or weaken it to some degree in a location, but the locations that aren't being heated to that degree are not weakened. So you'll have maybe local buckling and weakening where the airplane hit, but outside of that, the structure is still intact.
right. So yeah, we'll go more into this next time if you're cool with ending there, Eric, because they're going to go way more into detail because they with this whole organization called NIST, and they were like basically the guys hired to make the official story less dumb and more less preposterous and everything. So that'll be pretty cool next time. Well, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Deep Shiz podcast.